Hi, everybody.
Hello.
Welcome to our session. I'm Jason Levin. I'm the Executive Director at WGU Labs, and I'm with Todd Bloom, who's the Managing Partner of the WGU Labs Fund, and Marni Baker-Stein, who's the Chief Academic Officer and Provost of WGU. Today we're going to talk about the investment thesis of WGU broadly and get into some specifics about the Lab Fund as well. But the thesis for the whole of WGU is the same, whether it's seed or growth or corporate investments we're making. And that's, we focus on three key areas. First, the mission of the system is to create pathways to opportunity for all people. We focus on transitions from secondary education into post-secondary or transitions into the workplace. Then core teaching and learning, co-curricular services in post-secondary, as well as transitions to the workforce from post-secondary upskilling and reskilling. And the first three questions we ask ourselves when we look at any investment is this affecting student outcomes we care about? Those are access and completion, equitable access and completion, as well as return on investment. So that could be things at lower cost or lead to better job outcomes. The second question we ask is it big or can it be big? Is it a big problem? We're a big institution. We're attempting to create real change at scale, nationally here in the United States. And the third question we ask is this a transformative solution, or is this just a really incremental innovation? So that's the broad thesis. So I'd like to start asking my panelists some questions about the education technology space. So Marni, you've looked at many different education technology companies over the years. What do you think education technology gets right and wrong?
So I think that from my perspective, the most important thing with educational technology is that it centers on the problem to be solved in teaching or learning or assessment or pathways first. Get that right, and then figure out how you're going to sell it, not the other way around. And I think the best products out there, the best sort of EdTech success stories out there are the ones that were true to the problem space they were trying to solve for. And then they just hit it out of the park. And the two examples that I was talking about with Jason earlier that I just love is like Duolingo. Duolingo determined there was an opportunity in the amount of screen time people were using. And they thought, how could we use that basically addiction to our favor in creating some productive time for learning a language, which so many people want to do. They identified the problem, they identified the solution, they've hit it out of the park. Bright Horizons Family Services is another big company that determined that there was an incredibly important problem to be solved in supporting women and caretakers of their families who were really trying to also build their careers and creating services around childcare and elder care, et cetera, to support them as they were making and breaking into their careers. These are powerful problems. These are incredibly targeted solutions, and sometimes when you get it lucky, you can change the world when you're doing this kind of work.
Todd, I'm interested. You've been both working at large education technology companies as well as been an investor for a number of years. What do you look for? What do you think education technology gets right and gets wrong?
Yeah, I think I'd build off of what Marni shared in terms of staying close to the problem, but also some of these technology solutions, including some of the companies that we've invested in, both services and cash investments, have actually come out of universities, meaning they've been incubated at universities. Companies like Perceptive, which is a company we've invested in that does peer evaluation and peer feedback on various assignments. Another one's Boost out of Indiana University. Perceptive was out of University of Pittsburgh. What I like about that is these companies start with essentially a research base from the get-go, and that's really important to be able to demonstrate that these products actually have the outcomes that we all hope for, whether they're for students or for educators for that matter.
When companies pitch you, Todd, like as an investor, a lot of people want to talk to you here at this conference, I'm sure. What do they get right and what do they get wrong? Like, what do you like to hear, and what is a red flag for you?
Yeah, so we do typical diligence as any investor would, but then we also have some atypical, perhaps, kind of diligence that maybe some investors don't do. So certainly we're looking at management quality. We've built kind of our own assessment for management quality in the early stage businesses. We also look for product market fit, of course, and is there enough scale that the business can achieve in terms of growing their business? And then the other part that we look at is certainly financials, but really social impact. So the first thing that we did when we set up the Accelerator at WGU Labs as well as the fund is we try to determine how do we evaluate social impact, especially when we're talking about early stage businesses where there's not enough data. They don't have a large enough N in terms of users to be able to evaluate. So we put together this framework. You're welcome to take a look at it. It's at wgulabs.org, and if you click on Accelerator and scroll down, you can take a look at this framework and corresponding rubric. And what's been fantastic is it's actually attracted companies to us. I thought it would be another roadblock or a hoop to jump through, but in fact it hasn't. It's actually attracted those companies that aspire to be social impact minded, if you will. And we hope that as we work with these companies over time, we will get to the point where we can actually evaluate their impact in a more empirical way.
And Marty, as someone who receives a lot of pitches from a lot of vendors, what is the most important thing you need to see in a pitch? What are the things that they do right or do wrong?
Well, I guess I'll start with what they do wrong because there's a lot to improve upon in terms of the pitches we receive at WGU. So, one of the things that I always find remarkable with these pitches is these are folks coming to pitch to a totally online university with 130,000 students, right? And obviously everything we do is digital. And there is very little research into WGU prior to those conversations. So my first piece of advice is do your research about who you are talking to, not only that institution, but the person at the institution. And the second thing is, in these pitches, I would love it if somebody came and said, before I pitch you, what problem are you trying to solve, right? Obviously, whether you're pitching to me or whether you're pitching to one of my teams who are some of the deepest extreme practitioners in all of online education, they know what problems they want to solve. And if you start from that conversation, then you can really frame your pitch to what they need, or tell them, be honest, we don't do that, right? But here is what we do. And then the third thing is that I think people need to get right, especially early stage startups when they're coming to talk to us, is we are big. Like, we have to serve tens, if not hundreds of thousands of people with the software or with the applications, independent applications that are being pitched to us. And I think just knowing your customer, understanding what the problem to be solved is, and then getting real about how ready you are to scale from start in that first conversation. Those are the three things that I'd love to get right, because we love early stage startups. We love all the creative ideas that are coming out of the work that many of you do. But at the same time, we have business requirements that we need to serve, and we would like to start with those, not end with those after 6 or 7 or 8 conversations and then figure out, oh, this isn't going to work.
I'd just add one thing, and it kind of builds off of what you just shared, Marty, is get implementation right, meaning have the conversations even pre-closing the sale as to what is this going to look like and what's it going to take, not just for you as a provider of technology, but also what's it going to take for the institution, the time, the effort, and so forth. So implementation is so critical. Even a mediocre product implemented well is better than a great product not implemented well, right? So
Yeah, I think that's actually a learning I've had since starting the lab is, I've kind of my roots in like empirical evidence and scientific rigor, and instinctively I want to do a randomized controlled trial, but the fidelity of implementation is really important, and we end up doing actually a lot of implementation studies at WGU and other places that I think really add a lot of value to our clients.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Marni, what areas are you looking for innovation in? Like, where do you see pockets of innovation that are exciting to you?
Yeah, so you mean operationally, just at WGU?
Yeah.
So, operationally, there are two big areas that we are waiting sort of for a solution, I think. Waiting, creating, partnering. One of those areas is centralized 360-degree case management to actually serve our community of care. We have to, in order to create that community of care, which is all the different instructor roles and evaluators and student support and student services, we want to frame those around individual students and individual student journey, and we want them to be able to work as a team. And we can, of course, jerry-rig Salesforce or any CRM capability to try to get there, but that's not built for higher education or education, so it is jerry-rigging. It's clunky, it's not elegant, and it's not as powerful as we'd like it to be. It's certainly not built around the use case that we want to solve for with our students and serving them one by one. And then the other thing that we dream about in terms of being able to do is like a truly, we are not incredibly social at WGU in terms of the social experience that's part of the fabric of our learning. We get pitched add-on social environments all the time, which are really nice, and some of them are incredibly beautiful, powerful applications, but they are so isolated from the learning experience. So the other thing that we're really, really interested in is how do we integrate social and human connection in every moment of that learning and assessment experience, so that if a student is really working through a practice activity or a pre-assessment work or even a reading or watching a video, and they want to create community around that, they can basically throw down a beacon, and that community is there to discuss that moment of the digital experience that they're in and kind of rally around it, whether it is, hey, I watched this cool video, isn't this fascinating? Rally around a fascinating, or hey, I'm in this practice set and I've tried this activity multiple times and I still don't get it. Rally around that kind of call for help. Those are capabilities, those are digital infrastructure capabilities for a totally online university that are missing from our ecosystem. You can cobble them together as independent applications, but it's not the kind of total education experience that we would love to be able to provide our students.
I know we've invested in a number of different applications to try to get at that problem. I'm curious, so your thoughts on student belonging and connectiveness in digital environments.
Yeah, and other spaces that we're interested in that are not restricted only to a WGU-like model. We've certainly invested in a company called Protopia, for example, which is connecting existing students to alumni. I think there's a lot to be had in that arena. So Protopia is one of those companies, and Scribe is another one that WGU is using in various instances, where we're creating essentially a digital community attached to either courses, or what I really liked in terms of the use cases, how do you create belonging and community even pre-matriculation? So if you've been accepted to WGU or fill in the blank university, how do we create that sense of belonging before you even arrive, in quotes? So those are a couple of different companies.
What are other niches that you are interested in or find intriguing right now?
So I'm a former elementary school teacher, and it pains me to hear of all the teacher shortages and substitute teacher shortages, or that 60% of principals, according to one survey, are looking to leave the profession. This is catastrophic when you're activating the New Mexico National Guard to fill in for substitute teachers. That's a problem, and it pains me to hear that. So what are the ways in which we can fill that talent pipeline? Clearly, we do a lot at WGU in terms of educating teachers, and whether they're in service or pre-service, so that's a start, but we need more talent coming into the teaching profession. The other area that we like is career development. I don't think there's anyone here that wouldn't say that we need to focus on that for our graduates to be able to gain the employment that they're looking for, whether it's moving up, sideways, or their first job. But it's Wild West, at least from my perspective, in career center technologies and so forth. There's a couple incumbents, but we think we can potentially make some differences in those couple areas.
And Marni, we were talking earlier about there's a huge skills movement, and we're seeing an array of startups and skills-based education, compassing to careers. And I'm curious on your thoughts, because I know you've been thinking about that for a long time.
Yeah. So, and I think it's related to this emphasis on education to work and services for earner learners across a lifetime of building careers and educating oneself to take the next step. I think it is really amazing the emphasis on these types of applications here at ASU+GSV this year and last year. But what we're really working on, and I'm really interested in, is in a world that is unbundling in terms of programming, where students are across a lifetime taking certificates and degrees and other certificates and badges and certifications and stacking those up over a lifetime to sort of build value in their careers. What is the infrastructure underneath that helps them take that journey to make that next decision and to compass themselves, as well as allow employers to see them wherever they are and recognize the talent that they're building? And so that work on learner-owned records, learning employment records, and the development of whether it is a public good or not, an infrastructure to support lifelong journeys through education is really critical. And I think that kind of an infrastructure could really support all the energy that I'm seeing here at ASU+GSV, because right now it's like the metaphor that I like to use is the early railroad. Like in the early days of the railroad, there were over 100 railroad companies that would build all these little tracks to nowhere, essentially, 30, 40 miles of track, and they were all over the country. And it was awesome and great technology and really cool, like woohoo, we can go from here to there very quickly, more quickly than we ever had before. But it was not incredibly useful as a system. And it wasn't until folks decided to sort of meet up all these tracks at the Golden Spike, which happens to be in Utah. I don't know if you've ever been there, it's pretty cool. But like it wasn't until we met up at the Golden Spike that it became a system, and it became incredibly transformational, changed the world infrastructure, right? That changed everything. That drove the Industrial Revolution, that really moved the world forward. And that's the moment I think we are at with all of these activities is, yeah, we could float 1,000 boats that could change the world for individual learners and earner learners, but what's that infrastructure that supports it all is the common record that would guide students into what's best to do next. And that's I think, with that infrastructure, it becomes really powerful, and we're super interested in that in WGU.
I apologize. I smiled and shook my head. It just feels like we keep coming back to this over and over. The standards, like the common standards, data standards, and so forth. I almost think of like a USB or a plug in a standardized outlet. Like if you're the plug, the learner, I want to plug in, but I want to be able to plug into anything, right?
Yeah.
And that my data can flow and the data that I need can flow to me. And it's probably not a great analogy, but I feel like we keep coming back to the
and I own that data.
Yeah.
And we didn't need it in a world where the only credential that really mattered was a degree, and you got it mostly at one place, right? And you would just ask for that institution for your transcript, and they would charge you for it over and over again. But it was pretty easy to do. But in a world that is completely unbundled, and your achievements are across a lifetime, and you really want to keep track of those to continuously build out that profile, we have no infrastructure to support that in this country.
What other barriers do you see to that future besides the technical infrastructure?
I think one of the big barriers for it is that, at least in this country, there's no one entity to be accountable for what would be a public good infrastructure like that. And so the question becomes, could it ever even be a public good infrastructure in this country? Or is this something that a private entity kind of takes on, or it becomes something more like Facebook or Google or LinkedIn into the future? And like, how do we feel about that when it comes to identity management or the record of achievement for a learner? Like, is that something that should be private, or should that be a public good? So I think these questions are swirling, and it kind of makes it makes it very complex to make progress, because it's like, who should own that, right? Yeah.
I think philanthropy should have a place there, perhaps, to create a nonprofit or what have you that can create that standardization and so forth. And we've got wonderful philanthropies that are here.
Yeah.
If they could come together somehow and fund something big that we can all get on board with,
Yeah.
I think that would be awesome.
Yeah.
But there's fits and starts so far.
Yeah. One of the last questions I wanted to ask, I think we'll have time to open it up from the audience, is, inside higher ed, higher ed is preventing itself from innovating in a lot of ways. And I was curious, what do you think would be some key changes that could happen that would cause massive improvements in access and outcomes? Maybe we'll start with Marni.
Okay.
I know you have a thought on this.
I do have a thought. So I'll say what I always say about this, which is that if higher ed, now that we've gone through COVID and they've realized we really do need a digital infrastructure to support learning on our campuses, even if it's just in case this ever happens again, right? But we know that many of these universities are going toward online programs or hybrid programs or just digital components of on-ground programs. The digital age has finally arrived, I hope, right? But they have no way, most institutions outside of big online institutions have no way of thinking about that digital infrastructure as an infrastructure. They think about it as a choice that every faculty makes in their class, and sometimes they have some enterprise components, but it's very hit or miss. So I think what would really improve this into the future is that CTO, CIO at a university is on the executive leadership team and at the strategic table, and really understanding and driving forward strategy around the digital future of these universities. And then these universities should have the capacity to implement that future. It should not be a disaggregated capacity where individuals are expected to implement it in their individual context, but that they really are thinking strategically at the university level about the digital experience, just as they are about parking lots and football fields and dorms.
So get out of real estate.
Get out of real estate. Get into a different kind of real estate, I guess.
Todd, we work with a lot of different higher ed institutions at WGU Labs, and you have a lot of experience in the past. I'm curious, are there key changes you'd like to see to enable better student outcomes, better access to technology?
I really hope that COVID's had some impact on pedagogy in higher ed. I think it has. I think you've seen instructors have to go online, so to speak, and force themselves to kind of question, I did this in person, it doesn't work online, what do I do differently, but still has an impact on learning? And I kind of hope that that's shifted a little bit of the pedagogical kind of approaches that instructors have. I worry that, you go back to what you're familiar with typically, and I hope that doesn't happen. But I'm not a big fan of regulating change per se. I'm hoping that institutions will find, with pressure from real estate or just healthcare and talent that they have to pay for, that they'll start to second guess their financial model. And then finally, I think the third thing, hopefully it's just the student, that the student is a buyer.
Yeah.
And they're buying education, and hopefully the buyer is going to continue to demand a better ROI, and ROI both on the cost side as well as the outcome.
And the value.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Well, I think we can open it up to the audience, see if there's any questions from the panelists.
Well, I have a question. You described, Marni, something that is very robust in terms of weaving social learning into the whole perspective of the learning experience. If a startup is going to contract something with you, or with the institution, it's a startup. It's not a Pearson or Wiley with a strong balance sheet. How does that engagement would work? In a sense that they have the vision, they know how to do it, they are building it, but they do not have the financial resources yet to be vetted in a procurement process.
Yeah. Well, I do think that this is from my perspective, so I cannot speak for labs. So, but from my perspective, this is a moment where, especially if it's a startup that's working with a large online incumbent around a transformational change like this. And guess what? The large online incumbents are the ones who see the future on this front, right? But we have these incumbent technologies, right, that are floating our boat, and so it's complicated. It's complicated. So I think that complexity requires new forms of partnerships between the early stage startup and the incumbent that would benefit both, that would allow us to have the capacity and the amazing genius thinking around how we could really change our ways of doing and being as when it comes to pedagogy and assessment. But that early stage startup who probably has a small team, that probably has a limited scope of experience, also learns a ton about what it takes to operate this kind of capability at scale. And so those strategic partnerships, I think, have to be taken seriously. There are IP concerns in those partnerships. There are ownership concerns in those partnerships. But I do think that's the way we could get to applications that could be incredibly powerful. And it's a way that these big online universities could become real great incubators for things that could really have a big impact everywhere.
Yeah, I'll throw in a shameless plug for WGU Labs. So we are an accelerator, and we can provide exactly those types of services. We actually have a very deep understanding of how to integrate into WGU and their standards. And we've built some little, we have a thin technology layer that we can help plug in as well.
Do you want to talk about the services maybe a little bit?
Yeah, actually, we'll take one question and then we'll.
Sure.
Yeah, hi. You mentioned that WGU has currently 130,000 students, so that's amazing. But as you look into the future, where is for someone like WGU, where do you see the next growth coming from, or what are your strategic areas of growth looking forward?
So I think that growth comes from a couple different places for us into the future. One is that we have really doubled down on access and attainment and making sure that we are, exponentially moving the dial on our student success numbers. Our student success numbers are great, but we believe they can be even better. So we want to grow our ability to serve every student, regardless of their background or their learning experience prior to coming to us, does better with us and attains that credential. We are in a very large market of working learner students who have some college but no degree, and a large and growing first-time full-time market of students who want to get a degree but also want to work full-time and are very skeptical about taking out student loans. These are big numbers in terms of total addressable market. They are still not served in this country, and so we really are focused on growing out our impact in those marketplaces where we already serve. Yeah.
Just going back to your comment about partnerships, I really like your reference to the Golden Spike. And I agree that we're laying track today what feels like 30 miles at a time.
Yeah.
So my question for you is, thinking about the future, who do you think is the Union Pacific of today? Right? Who is that large company that can pull it together?
That was my point about accountability. Who is that? Who is Union Pacific, right? And if that's a conglomerate, if that's a collaboration across institutions, what is the convening platform for that collaboration? I think my answer to that question is question mark. I could make a couple of guesses, but I think that remains to be seen, and it's really important that we figure that out because we need that kind of convener.
Do you think it's public, or do you think it's private, or do you think it's a combination of the two?
Or
is it higher education, like somebody as big as SNHU? Is it Google? Is it AWS?
well, I would hope it's not SNHU.
Or Google.
No No offense to SNHU. So I'm just kidding.
There's a bigger institution I can think of.
There's a bigger institution I can think of. Yeah, I think what we've seen, so I don't know how many of you know this, but we accidentally, in many ways, started the Open Skills Network 2 years ago at the beginning of COVID. And that started out with a small group that included, foundations and big companies, and WGU and UMGC, Southern New Hampshire University was involved in it as well as just a lot of the open standards groups like IMS Global and Credential Engine and et cetera. And we were at a meeting at dinner just 2 days prior to COVID hitting and got together and we're like, hey, we need to do something about this skills movement. What's the platform? Who are the people who can actually bring definition to this and sort of push a community forward around it? And so we decided we were going to start the Open Skills Network, and we thought it would just be us. And now we have over 1,200 members globally, over 700 institutions that are part of that. And it's amazing how hungry the world seemed to be at the moment for that kind of collaboration and that sort of collective work. So I think it's probably something like that. I think it's a combination of employers, educators, foundations, as well as some of the big convening powers in this country that can come together and get us started on this work.
Mm-hmm. Michael.
A follow-up question to the question and the answer. You have this incredible experience with the Open Skills Network and both its potential and I'm sure the challenges of managing a particular open community. And you've talked about open infrastructures related. I'm wondering how you think more broadly about various kinds of openness, licenses and communities as facilitators to create the kinds of ecosystems for the change that you want?
I think we've found ourselves in the position as a convener of open standards and infrastructure and as a collective toward a practical end, like a learning and employment record or a skills-based hiring and education. We've found ourselves capable of doing that, of being the spark. But we don't see ourselves as the owner of those over time. We really see these as if we can incubate them, even if it's by accident, if we can incubate them, that they really do need to become separate entities from WGU if they're going to stand on their feet over time.
Jason, what does the Accelerator do in terms of services that it provides?
Yeah, we didn't talk about, we built a non-traditional accelerator. It's almost not right to call it an accelerator. And it's really the brainchild of Todd Bloom, and so I'm curious,
That's how I get to answer the question.
Yeah.
If I ask you to answer, okay. So it is an accelerant of early stage businesses. We believe that there's far too few EdTech companies out there that actually have either invested in research or have either come from research or what have you to demonstrate their impact on learners, teachers, what have you. And so we provide research as a service. We have a team that's led by Bethany Gross, fantastic director of our research, who does everything from like RCTs we've done, quasi-experimental studies, correlational studies, and even starting the basics of a logic model, and it being research-based as well. So that's one component of the services we provide. Again, early stage businesses, so think pre-Series A, typically seed stage. The other area is just one of our clients, Inscribe, I don't know if Katie's here, but she said, you help us be a thought leader in our niche within education via whether it's writing, so we help companies write op-eds and get them placed, so very PR-ish, but it's also convening folks that they care about, meaning whether they're thought leaders or potential customers from universities. And so one part is research and the other part is what we call market development. And we do get paid for, we're not a philanthropy, so we do get paid in the form of equity in these businesses in exchange for the services. And yes, we do make cash investments in those businesses. But really important from my perspective, and I think from my colleagues' perspective, is the fund exists only to kind of de-risk our services investment. It's not about the cash, it's really about how do we support businesses that have similar interests that we have in terms of making change and that have a social impact kind of orientation.
And you're really, I think one of the awesome things about Bethany's group in particular is that you are really pushing forward the whole field of intervention science and understanding how these applications can really impact individuals against outcomes. So you're really moving the science forward too as well.
Yeah, I mean, we have a large group of what we call LXDs, or learning experience designers, in addition to the researchers as well. So yeah.
I have one more question. Can you give an example, since both of you get pitched all of the time, of the worst pitch you've ever heard? And if you're not willing to incriminate anyone, maybe just some of your top no-nos in pitching.
Top no-nos?
Yes.
Not talking about the mission of the business. I think that's the top no-no. If you're not, it's not enough to say, well, of course I'm, social impact minded. I'm a education business. I represent it. That's not enough. Like, articulate that. What does that look like? How do you measure that? If you avoid that conversation with us, at least in terms of the accelerator and the investment fund, it's a no-go for us.
Yeah, I agree. And not really asking what the problem is to be solved that's always just a big signal to me that I shouldn't really take the pitch seriously. And then the other thing is just not doing the background research and pitching something that we would obviously in our model never need, right? Which I get pitched things that I would never need in a billion years all the time. And I'm like, wow, what a waste of time that email was, or that call was, or, for them and for us.
Yeah, one specific one that irritates me is like I get a lot of like outlandish claims about AI. So,
Yeah. Vaporware.
yeah.
On the flip side, what I love to see and hear is when a early stage business will have, whether it's a video or they usually don't have the customer come, but a story directly about a customer, a use case that goes deep as an example of what they do.
Yeah.
I like to hear from the horse's mouth, as it were. So that's always a good approach.
Yeah.
I might suggest a book that's really helpful in this space too. It's called Good in a Room. It was drafted and written by a woman who heard hundreds, if not thousands, of pitches at a Hollywood studio, people coming in and pitching their story, and she has really delineated that these are the things that made a difference in terms of why we took the pitch or didn't, and it is worth her read.
Yeah, that's great. Because I think what everyone should recognize, if somebody takes your call or agrees to hear your pitch, especially at a big university or someone at a high level in a university, they're doing it because they have a problem. Otherwise, they would not be wasting their time talking to you. So figure out what is the problem that they have as the first step, and then be there to volunteer to solve it for them, because otherwise, that's what is always shocking to me. Why do you think I'm meeting with you? Is it just to hear your great idea? No, it is because I have a problem that I need fixing, and I'm hopeful that you're going to bring me the solution.
Great. Well, thank everybody for coming. We appreciate your time.
Thank you.